Hey folks, so in this video, what I want to discuss is the basic operating system services that the user will need. So we have this nice bullet point list here, right? And we're going to kind of go over this, little by little. The idea here, right, is we want to have some sort of idea of the different pieces of functionality that an operating system needs to provide, right? This is kind of like the bare minimum for a user to be able to do stuff, right? Without these features, you kind of are just looking at a box that you can't interact with, right? You can't even run anything on it, right? So what are the most basic services, right, that an operating system needs to provide? And there's this nice diagram in the book, right, that kind of shows this hierarchy, right, of how things go together. There's this general scheme here of basically having low-level things, right? For example, basically low-level system services, right? So things that the OS is really responsible for, they're low-level things, right? The OS has to provide, right? And actually, let me turn on my pointer here. I have kind of this idea, right? These low-level things, right, that I need to support. And then, right, the idea is that the OS, right, is going to implement all these kind of really basic things, right, that I can use, right, in other programs, right? Well, okay, so I'm kind of combining a couple ideas here, right? First of all, right, the idea is your operating system basically is going to be the place to go to, right, for some services, because those services are so low level that the only place that's going to know how to implement those services is the OS, right? Think about that for a second. If you write a program, right, could be in Java, could be in C, you don't really know all the behind-the-scenes work that's necessary to do something like get the system time, because that's going to be really specific to your computer. And so it would make sense for those things basically to be the responsibility of your operating system, right? Your operating system is going to know how to do really, really low-level stuff, and it's going to basically provide that as a service, right, to other things running on your system. And so what I've highlighted here basically is that really, really low-level stuff that your operating system should basically enable, should support, should know how to do these things. Because really it's the only one with enough knowledge about your system to be able to support things, right? To know how to use your hard drive, to know how to use your memory, to know how to use that system clock, right? Those things are really specific to your hardware. There's probably a lot of stuff under the hood that needs to happen for those. Your day-to-day programs aren't going to know all of that stuff. Really what they would want is the ability to go to your operating system and say, hey, what is the system time, right? That should be encapsulated. And specifically here, right, it'll be encapsulated in what we call a system call. So that's actually kind of this little layer over here, right? And we're going to go into more detail on this in future videos, but that's kind of our layer above what the operating system is providing, okay? So you have a bunch of system calls, which are maybe things like, okay, get date, get time, right? That would be exposed to your programs. You'd be able to call that. And under the hood, that would be routed to the OS, and the OS's job would be, how do I figure out, based on my hardware, right? How do I answer that question, right? How do I answer that query? How do I get the current day? How do I get the current time, right? That's what the OS will do. Then up top, right, we basically have the stuff sitting on top of the system calls, sitting on top of the OS, which is, basically user programs, right? So this is, this could be simple things, right? Because this could be, for example, your File Explorer, right, in Windows, right? It could also be your Visual Studio, your NetBeans, or whatever else you're running, right? Any other program in your system, right? These are high-level things that are basically going to leverage those system calls, right, to do their work, right? And the system calls kind of filter down to talk to our hardware, right, at a lower level, right, based on how the OS is wanting to handle that. Let's jump back to the list on the left-hand side. So this is some idea, right, of basically some features that your OS should support, right? So these are low-level services, right, that your other programs are going to end up wanting to use. So for example, right, user interfaces, right? So this is, kind of a class of utility / a class of software here, right? So a user interface somehow is referring to basically how does the user interact with your system, right? So you have, for example, a graphical user interface, right, or a command line interface, or a batch level interface, right? Point is, right, we want to support some sort of interactivity with our system, because if we don't have interactivity, well, we can't really do anything, right? It's just going to be a box there that it just sits and does the same thing all day, right? It's not really going to be something that the user is going to be interested in using, right? So we need to provide some sort of a user interface, right? And so you can kind of think, right, that there are actually many kind of elements behind the scenes, right? So if I think of, like, for example, a desktop environment, my user interface has to include things like, for example, displaying things, right? So maybe displaying a folder or a file, right? That's somehow having to do with interacting with your monitor or your graphics card. It also has to take input, right? So it has to be able to deal with interacting with your keyboard or your mouse, right? And these all kind of come together to give you the experience of a user interface where the user does something and they see some result from it, right? I click on a button, right, and a new window opens, right? That's kind of interaction, right? So this is kind of the first thing that we want to enable, right? There's kind of this mix here between things that maybe the user, sees and touches, right? And actually, the low-level hardware, right, that maybe is providing input or output, right, based on what the user does. Okay, so this is kind of our first thing we want to support. The second thing we want to support is program execution. So the idea is this, right? When you click on a file to run it, stuff actually has to happen, right? So for us, right, we click on a file, we run it, it's like, okay, everything is just good to go. But in practice, right, there's many things that need to happen behind the scenes. Think about it. If you click on a file, what has to happen, right, is we have to load it first into memory, right? My program, right, is going to have some data in there, right? It's going to have some program code, it's going to have some data. Well, that needs to be brought into memory. right? We need to go and basically ask for CPU time to actually run the thing. And then we do kind of all these setup operations. We need to keep track of things like, what is the current line of my program? What does it want to do next, right? I need to let it run, right? And as it runs, it maybe will need to request memory, right? It'll need to change contents of memory. It may need to do all sorts of things, right? I have to go step by step, right, line by line to that program and run everything that it wants to run, right? And I need to give it all the resources it needs in order to do those things, right? And so that as a whole, right, kind of makes up our need for this program execution. So that's going to be kind of our second thing that our operating system needs to support. It needs to support basically running programs, right? Running programs, giving them resources, switching between programs so that I can run multiple programs at the same time. All of these things, right, an operating system needs to support. All right, next one, I/O operations. So I/O, right, kind of is on the border of things that really touch hardware, right? So reading from the mouse, reading from the keyboard, writing to the hard drive, right? Writing to your SSD, writing to a printer, whatever. These are all I/O operations, right? And this is going to be another area where your OS kind of needs to step in because your user software isn't going to know things like, for example, how do I use this specific printer or this specific mouse? Really, that's stuff that the operating system should be in charge of, and it should really just expose some general interface to your programs to use those devices, right? And so I/O, right, I guess hopefully you can kind of get the idea there is I/O kind of is a very general thing, right? Input-output operations, right? I/O. It doesn't mean specifically, just like a hard drive or just a mouse. It means everything, right? Every kind of external device is connected to your system. Because every external device is connected to your system, well, you're going to, at some point, want to send information to it or get information back from it, right? So it's very generic. And we'll basically talk through some of the ways we interface those devices later on. And you'll see that there are basically some very generic ways to do that because you never know, right, what's going to be connected to your system. All right, next bullet point, file system manipulation. So this is going to be, right, kind of something that the user is always doing, right, which is, creating files, reading files, modifying files, right? It's very typical, right, that you have, a hard drive, 2 hard drives. You have many drives on your system, right, that all store data of some sort. Because when you're using a computer, well, you're going to be, basically manipulating information, right? So for me, right, I'm recording a video right now, right? So there's a hard drive somewhere that this file, right, is being saved onto, right? I need to have some place, right, that I can store my data, right? So I need to have some file system. And there's going to be a file system, right, that has video 1, video 2, video 3, has everything that we've recorded, right? This is kind of a very basic thing because otherwise, right, we have no way to basically have persistence, right? To have something from one session to another, right? I need to record this video, right? It needs to be saved to a hard drive so they can go to somebody else, they can edit it, right, on their hard drive, right? And then they'll eventually send me an edited copy that I'll go and upload to YouTube, right? So I need to have some way, right, for data to be persistent, right? So my operating system has to support that. It has to support storing files, has to know who has rights to view them, where the file is, how large the file is. It needs to provide mechanisms like for me to copy or move it, all these sorts of things, right? Very common. All right, getting down to the end of the list there, communication. So communication basically is, well, here, right, you can think of it basically as being the internet, right? So maybe I need to communicate to another web server somewhere and basically say, hey, I want to view a web page, right? That's something the operating system needs to support. It needs to support the ability to basically work with a network, right? And so a network could be maybe local, right? It could be just computers, in the same room, right, or the same floor of the building, or they can be remote, right? They can be, on the other side of the world, right? So some sort of a web server somewhere. The point is I want to basically be able to go ask another computer, right, another device somewhere out there, a question, right? I need to ask, can you show me this web page, right? Or what is the contents of this page? If I put this as an input, can you give me something back, right? Can you give me a file to download, right? So that's going to be kind of another service the operating system needs to support, is just communicating with external devices. Last thing here is error detection. So this is maybe, you can picture, right, and it's not too common anymore, but this is like the blue screen of death, right, from Windows, right? Your program's running, all of a sudden it accesses memory it shouldn't have, it crashes, right, and you get this nice blue screen that tells you there's been an error, right? And the operating system is actually telling you, oh, there's been an error, and I'm going to stop you right now because if you do anything further, you might actually damage something, right? So this is their job, the operating system, basically to monitor all the different programs that are running, and obviously, right, programs aren't going to be perfectly written, right? There's a chance it may break. It's going to monitor them, and when it sees there's some sort of an issue, it's going to try and step in and maybe correct it, or correct it, recover from it, that type of thing, right? So if you have a kind of a system level error, right, it'll give you that blue screen. It'll say you can't do anything else. You have to reboot because it doesn't want you to damage anything. Maybe you have kind of a simpler error, right? Maybe the program just hits an endpoint, right, and it just crashes right immediately. You won't get a blue screen, but you get a little warning box that says, okay, this program has crashed, right? In which case you can close it, maybe reopen it. Right? Point is, the operating system is going to be watching for that. It's going to be watching for programs doing things that they shouldn't, right? Because when a program does something like, for example, read memory that it doesn't belong to it, basically what that implies is that program is, off the rail, right? It's doing something it's not allowed, it's somehow broke, right? And the operating system is going to watch for that, and when it sees that kind of problem, it can basically stop the program, right, and shut it down, and hopefully you can go back, right, and do something else, right? Because again, that program, right, did something it wasn't supposed to. Presumably there's some sort of a bug, right? It's going to give you strange behavior. We don't want that, so the operating system kind of can watch for that stuff. All right, so these are our overall system services. These are kind of the low-level things the operating system needs to provide, right, to enable kind of the basic experience of a system to the user.